Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining the Connecting the Dots Lessons Learned from a Comprehensive Juvenile Justice Systems Improvement webinar. Over the next 60 minutes or so, we will learn about the research and history of reform efforts underpinning the Improving Outcomes for Youth approach and why, as and we will also learn about 3 states' experiences participating in the Improving Outcomes for Youth initiative, including the challenges they were seeking to address, the assessment process, and the legislative, administrative, and funding changes that resulted from their efforts. We will also have time, hopefully time at the end, for questions. So throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, feel free to enter them in the chat box, and we will do our best to answer them at the end. So your speakers for today are myself, Chanel Johnson. I'm a policy analyst with the Council of State Governments Justice Center. We also have Ross Armstrong, who is the administrator at the Division of Child and Family Services in Nevada. We also have Nick Costales, who is the Deputy Director of Field Services at the Division of Children, Youth, and Families Department in New Mexico, as well as Adam Zarin, who is the Policy Advisor at the Office of Governor Jared Polis in Colorado. The Council of State Governments Justice Center is a national nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We develop research-driven strategies to increase public safety and strengthen communities. We also deliver technical assistance and training for Second Chance Act grantees. We advance the knowledge base of the reentry field, promote what works in reentry and success of grantees, facilitate peer networking and information exchange, as well as providing information for people returning to communities and to their families. So today I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the national landscape and then use Texas as a case study for what we're seeing around the country in terms of juvenile justice improvement efforts and what policymakers and juvenile justice leaders are struggling with as they try to improve outcomes for youth in their systems. So nationally, there has been a 61% decline in juvenile justice incarceration rates, which is a testament to the hard work and commitment to serving youth closer to their homes and in their communities. However, as states and jurisdictions have started shifting kids away from these large correctional facilities and serving them instead in their communities, policymakers and system leaders are left wondering, how are these youth doing? Are we getting better results for kids in terms of recidivism and other youth outcomes? Are we spending our resources most efficiently? And what outcomes are we getting as a result? Texas is an example of a state that has adopted and implemented a number of improvement initiatives over the past 10 years or so that resulted in a significant decline in their juvenile incarceration rates. Some examples of these improvement efforts include prohibiting commitment to state-run secure facilities for misdemeanor offenses, closing a state-run secure facility, and designating $25 million for community mental health services. Texas policymakers wanted to better understand the impacts of these various initiatives on youth outcomes, so they commissioned the Council of State Governments Justice Center to do a study to learn more about the services and supervision youth were receiving in the community and what recidivism rates looked like as a result. So the Council of State Governments Justice Center conducted an apples-to-apples comparison of youth who were eligible for incarceration and were either supervised in the community or in state-run secure facilities. The good news is that youth who are supervised in the community have better outcomes. Youth released from state-run secure facilities were 21% more likely to be rearrested than youth supervised in the community, and youth who were released from state-run secure facilities were also 3 times more likely to commit a felony when recidivating. Additionally, per capita funding for county juvenile probation departments in Texas increased significantly after these reforms, but what kind of results were counties getting for their money? And this is where the bad news comes in. Resource investments in community supervision and services didn't make the impact that leaders had expected or wanted. Youth who received no intervention at all had the same probability of rearrest as youth who received various types of programming. What the study found upon taking a deeper look was that a larger percent of low-risk youth under supervision received services. And what we know from research is that with lower-risk youth, you can do nothing at all, and they will naturally grow out of their adolescent behavior. And also that it's a better use of limited resources to serve higher-risk youth. Additionally, we found that not only were programs and services targeting more low-risk youth, they were also targeting youth that did not have high needs. And we can see here on this slide that low-risk youth also stayed in programs longer than high-risk youth in many counties. And this is a trend that we've seen often in many states and jurisdictions, as low-risk youth tend to be easier to engage and easier to serve than higher-risk youth. Lastly, another reason for the recidivism outcomes we found was that youth were not being matched with services that targeted their individualized needs, and that the services were not adhering to the research and were not being implemented with fidelity. So what we found in Texas has key implications for other states who are looking to improve outcomes for youth in their juvenile justice systems. So some of those implications are, one, that state and local jurisdictions can reduce the number of incarcerated youth without compromising public safety. Youth supervised closer to home have lower rearrest rates than similar youth released from state-run secure facilities. Increased resources are not sufficient to reduce recidivism and improve outcomes for youth on community supervision and returning from incarceration. And lastly, resources must be used efficiently to match youth with the appropriate level and type of research-based supervision and services based on their assessed risks and needs. The National Reentry Resource Center operates the Improving Outcomes for Youth Initiative, which is also known as the IOYouth initiative. And that initiative helps states and jurisdictions align their juvenile justice policies, practices, and resource allocations with what research shows works to reduce recidivism and improve outcomes for youth by answering these 3 key questions about their juvenile justice system. First, what are the recidivism rates and other outcomes for youth under system supervision? And is data collected and used to track, analyze, and improve these outcomes? Are resources used efficiently to provide services for youth most at risk of reoffending? And are the services youth receive demonstrated as effective? And finally, are youth matched with the appropriate level and length of supervision, and is supervision focused on addressing youth needs, youth risks and needs? The Improving Outcomes for Youth initiative has 4 key phases of work. The first phase is the formation of a task force made up of legislators, agency leadership, judicial officials, and other stakeholders to oversee the initiative. The next phase is the analysis of qualitative and case-level data and a review of state policies and practices. Third, development of system improvement recommendations based on the findings from the assessment. And lastly, the adoption of legislative and appropriation changes. There are also several prerequisites that are necessary for the IOYouth initiative to be successful. Strong leadership from task force members that are committed to both the assessment process and the resulting improvement efforts. Transparency and timely sharing of available juvenile justice data. commitment across all three branches of government, state and local agencies, and stakeholder groups to identify policy changes that may result from the initiative. And lastly, collaboration across youth-serving systems, branches of government, and state and local entities as applicable. So now I'm going to turn things over to Ross, Nick, and Adam to talk about IOYouth in Nevada, New Mexico, and Colorado. So Ross?
Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. And you can see on the next slide what the assessment findings were once we had an assessment of the Nevada system. We had, similar to most of the country, had decreases in arrests for violence and weapons, and just decreases in our overall population. For example, we had one facility that, 10, 15 years ago was at a capacity of 200 youth. That currently we're just at about 60 youth. When we took all the different money that was spent on juvenile justice, it was about $95 million for the state of Nevada, and the assessment basically said we don't even know if we're getting our money's worth for that money. So we worked to create a bill during the 2017 session. One other key finding was there was no standard definition of recidivism. So, for example, we had one county program that says there's no, they have a 97% success rate, but they weren't counting. They just said, well, only 3% actually come back to this facility. They weren't looking at actual other juvenile justice involvement. And so those were the key findings in the Nevada assessment, and we had the technical assistance to walk us through those findings. There was lots of communication and back and forth to land on those findings and really digging down into the numbers to make sure that they were accurate. So with that as the setting, we move on to the next slide. You'll see our Juvenile Justice Reform Bill, which was Assembly Bill 472 out of the 2017 session. In the state of Nevada, we have legislative sessions every other year. The bill was sponsored out of the governor's office. The governor gets about 5 or 6 big policy bills, and he took this on as one of his bills. Some key parts of the Juvenile Justice Reform Bill in Nevada required DCFS and the local departments to use state funds on evidence-based practices. Just as a quick explainer of how our system is in Nevada, we have a bifurcated system. So the counties do the front end. The probation, detention is all county operated. And then if a youth is committed to corrections, they then go to our state agency, the Division of Child and Family Services. And then we also operate our Youth Parole Bureau. So once a youth is adjudicated and sent to the state, then we carry that youth for the rest of their juvenile justice involvement. And so the bill required that both the State Division of Child and Family Services and local departments use state funds on evidence-based practices. There was concern from a lot of the jurisdictions that we just didn't have those services in Nevada, and so over the next few years, there'll be an increasing percentage of programs that have to be evidence-based. We also established a cost-sharing model for those evidence-based programs, and then requires DCFS to submit an annual report on the compliance with establishing the evidence-based standards so that we know how each jurisdiction and the state is doing in terms of providing evidence-based standards. It also, along with that, we implemented the YLS risk and needs assessment, and so we're really taking a closer look at matching youth to the services that meet their needs. We had a lot of homegrown programs and things we all think are great, but again, we weren't doing the data collection to make sure that they were actually meeting the needs of the youth. So those reporting and compliance elements apply to that as well. One of the key things, because we had the bifurcated system, was to ensure that all of the agencies were complying with data collection and evidence-based practice regulations. And in Nevada, we have a community corrections block grant, which is general fund from the state to the counties based on population. And this bill allows for portions or all of that money to be withheld if a local jurisdiction is not complying with the data collection pieces, knowing that getting the data is critical to actually making sure that the programs that we are putting in place are effective. We haven't done that yet in terms of enforcing that, which I'll get to in a couple more slides. It also required the division to analyze and determine trends, so there's no requirement. There were lots of data collection requirements previously, but there was not a lot of analysis. So our county and state agencies produced a lot of pretty graphs, but then they just produced them to produce them, and that wasn't very helpful. Most importantly, I think, for us is that it established the Juvenile Justice Oversight. It's actually a commission to oversee the selection and adoption of the validated risk and needs assessment to create a strategic plan. We had 2 or 3 different juvenile justice groups going, and the creation of this has kind of made those others fall to the wayside. So we have a centralized group taking a look at juvenile justice in Nevada. So where are we now with the implementation? On the next slide, you'll see kind of the big milestones from that legislation. The first thing is we picked the risk and needs assessment tool. That was the YLS, and we anticipate pilot implementation to begin in July 1st of 2019. So we have an enforcement mechanism at the state. The AB 472 language requires that certain findings are made before a juvenile is committed, and they have to be based on that risk and needs assessment tool. So we have been training the state and local agencies in the use of that tool, how to complete it. And our pilot counties, we have 3 or 4 pilot counties, beginning July 1st, then the state will not accept a commitment of a youth who does not have those required findings and the prior completed YLS. We have the Juvenile Justice Commission adopted the 5-year strategic plan, and the different subcommittees of the commission have all been assigned different pieces of that strategic plan. Another element of the reform included ensuring a validated facility quality assurance review. So we chose the correctional program checklist, and the law required that the 3 state facilities and 2 county camps, which are kind of mid-level facilities, get an annual review. And so we have completed those reviews for all 5 facilities and present that information back to that oversight commission. And then we have the Foundation for Data Collection and Analysis. So part of the investment, along with the AB 472 reforms, included everybody going onto a unified data case management system. And so as we launch into the summer, we should start to be able to collect data easily from all the jurisdictions and do that analysis piece. We learned some lessons, some pretty good lessons through the whole process. The legislation passed unanimously, I think thanks in help to the governor deciding to sponsor it. This is a popular topic in general. We had buy-in from agency leadership of all 3 branches. So we had judiciary, legislative, and executive through the entire process. So the task force that took a look at the findings and came up with the recommendations for the bill all had high-level leadership in all 3 branches. And then we really had on that task force, the members were invested in the success of the reform. So it was not a heavy lift to convince us that we needed to have some changes. There were plenty of disagreements in exactly how to go about those changes, but we as a state were ready to go forward with some actual structural changes. Some of the challenges we learned, the legislative drafting process complicated some things. They had some legal opinions throughout the process that put up some roadblocks, but we were able to overcome those. And then we struggled to get racial diversity on the initial task force and still are working on that with our commission. One of the key things that we had to do was kind of overcome the suspicion of the outsider infiltration. So in terms of the technical assistance, it took some warming up to the folks who were assisting us, just I think every state is like, well, nobody knows how we do it here type of attitude. So it took some time to get through that, and we mostly got there. And I think the biggest thing that we learned and continues to be a challenge is the implementation deadlines in the bill. And so when you go about doing reform, I think everybody wants to just change the world right away, and the implementation timelines that were recommended in the initial draft of the bill were not realistic and got changed, but those still were not realistic. And so essentially last July, if the defense bar wanted to, they could have ground the entire Nevada juvenile justice system to a halt, but they did not, thankfully, and we continue to roll out training on the risk and needs assessment tool, and we're actually ready for some of the implementation pieces starting this summer. So if you're looking at doing reforms in your state, whether it's legislation or just by policy, take a look at those implementation dates. I think that is one where we were overconfident and not really clear-eyed in terms of all the steps needing to actually implement these broad changes. And we'll know more about our successes in true reform, I think, by probably this coming winter or early next year. We'll start to see all those implementation pieces, the enforcing no kids getting committed to the state without the proper findings, and the risk and needs assessment tool done, and then as well as the data collection and evidence-based program requirements. We'll start doing that oversight and enforcement throughout the summer. So those are the lessons we learned in Nevada. We're still plowing through. It's exciting to be on the cusp of being able to see the actual implementation of the reforms. And so with that, that's the end of the Nevada presentation.
Thanks, Ross. Nick, do you want to talk about New Mexico?
Yes, thank you so much, Chanel. I'd like to start off a little bit just talking about our experience with CSG coming in. It was kind of a long process of kind of getting the governor's office to buy in, not because New Mexico wasn't interested in reform, but it just seemed like there was a whole lot of other things going on at the time. But, getting the support of the governor's office and then inviting Council of State Governments Justice Center to come in was just pretty amazing experience. I think one of the things that we learned during this process is not only with the research showing the things that, we certainly had some gaps and things that we needed to improve on, but it was also a great experience to see so many of the things that we were doing well. So I'm going to start off with going through some of the bullet points that you're seeing on the screen that we learned from the assessment findings. The half of all the referrals going to our system for status offenses and petty misdemeanors. One of the ways, kind of as Ross was explaining his system, I'd like to talk just briefly about what we have here in New Mexico. So we have a statewide probation system in New Mexico, which means that even though we do have, county jurisdictions with their own judicial judges, we have a statewide system. So looking at data and looking at implementation of various things is much easier to do in a state where it's one unified system. So as we were looking at the referrals that were coming in, we really needed to look at the process of how referrals were coming to us. In New Mexico, all referrals come directly to the probation department, which is really a benefit in being able to do diversion work, being able to do reform, because we have the opportunity to look at these referrals before anything else needs to happen to them. In New Mexico, built into our statutes, we actually have that the probation department can handle up to 3 misdemeanor referrals within a 2-year period. We can handle those on an informal basis. Now, certainly we can send some of those to the district attorney's office, which is the next step in our system, or we can handle them on a lower level. So having all referrals for status offenses and petty misdemeanors, certainly that's not the kind of numbers we would like to see, because we know that many youth that touch the system actually have worse outcomes, and many kids that come in for lower level offenses would be better off if we actually did nothing to them. So even though the numbers were a little bit high as far as what was coming into us, we did take advantage of the opportunity that the probation department is the agency that actually gets to handle these referrals first. On the second bullet point there, the risk assessment tool, we do have a risk assessment tool that we use in New Mexico, but one of the things that really wasn't news to us is that we weren't really being able to use that tool in the most effective way. It certainly did not guide disposition, as the bullet point says. Part of that is it was an older tool. We had the tool for many years, and it had not been revalidated probably in about 10 years. And when we had implemented that tool many years ago, it was designed to be used in a system that we just weren't using anymore. As part of the reform efforts we've done in New Mexico, we've really spent a lot of time looking at case processing and trying to speed up those times so that youth aren't spending longer periods in detention that they need to be. But what that created then was the tool was designed to actually be used in between disposition and adjudication. So, usually a youth would go before a judge, they would make a plea, and then they would return in a couple of weeks to actually have their disposition, and the tool was supposed to be used during that period. Well, to try to speed up case processing times, oftentimes the adjudication and the disposition now happen on the same day. So it did not allow a time period for us to use the tool in the way that it was designed. So we really were not getting the results out of the tool that we had. On the third bullet point, the proportion of time a youth spends in a secured facility has increased by 10%. And then, of course, extensions have increased as well. Here in New Mexico, as part of our reform efforts, we've reduced the amount of youth that are in our secure facilities. It probably wasn't more than even a decade, if even that far back, that we had anywhere between 700 to 800 youth in our secure facilities. And I think when I looked at our report this morning, we were down to about 135 youth in secure facilities statewide. Now, with the reduction in youth in those facilities, it usually means we have a higher level of kid that is in our facilities. So they are spending a much more lengthy period of time in our facilities, and that actually goes back a little bit to not having a good risk assessment tool. Oftentimes our staff are left to do a best guess type scenario of when they've met the goals and when a youth should come up for release consideration. So it just shows the importance of having a good risk tool. In New Mexico, extensions, what that means is a youth that receives either a 1 or 2 year commitment can be taken back in front of their sentencing judge. And if they have not met their goals, then their time can be extended from either a 6-month period or up to a 1 year period, depending on their initial disposition. Once again, not having a validated tool to help guide those decisions meant that we were probably keeping youth in a secure facility much longer than they needed to be. And that final bullet point that you see there, that 1 in 5 youth with informal disposition receive another disposition. One of the struggles that we've had, and many states go through this, is really defining what recidivism is. Is it simply a violation when you're on conditions? Is it simply a new referral for a delinquent offense? I think we've come to a pretty good definition now, and part of it was because we knew we needed it for our work and to be able to really track the data, but it's also a requirement that we have from our legislative body as well. We're required to submit quarterly reports back to our legislature. And the constant question they were asking is, how are you going to be defining recidivism? So even the simple definition of recidivism is a obstacle. Sometimes I'm doing good work, and the assessment findings really showed us how we weren't able to track that very well to really get some good outcomes. So we can move on to the next slide. Out of the work that we did with the Council of State Governments was to come up with the Juvenile Justice Reform Bill. A couple of things that were highlighted with the research that they had done, and it was pretty extensive research. I do like bragging about New Mexico in the sense that we track pretty good data, and the other thing that we do, it's all public. We put it out on our website so that anybody can access our data. I mean, we have annual reports going back probably 10 to 15 years. But what we were seeing is that we still weren't diverting enough lower level youth and we were spending resources, especially when you have limited dollars, we were spending resources on those lower level youth and not really focusing on the higher risk youth that were the public safety concern. As I mentioned before, all the research shows that many youth are better off not being brought into a formal system. So we wanted to make sure that our limited resources were being focused on the ones that really had the greatest need. We looked at requiring certain offenses to be diverted automatically, and then also establishing a minimum age of juvenile delinquency. Right now, New Mexico does not have a minimum age of delinquency, so although it doesn't happen that often, it's not unheard of to have a police officer submit a delinquency report or a police report to our agency charging a 7, 8, or even 9-year-old with a felony offense. And as we know, first of all, youth of that age have no purpose being in a formal system. And even though we would divert those out, just the fact that we were receiving police reports for felony offenses for people that young is not something that we needed to be doing. So we'd look to establish a minimum age of delinquency with our bill. The adoption of a risk and needs assessment instrument, I've certainly talked a little bit about that already, about why the importance of having a tool like that. What we were looking at is not only identifying a tool, but actually requiring the use of that tool. You never want to get to the point where you're requiring a judge or a prosecutor or even a probation department to use the results, but certainly to consider those and any of their dispositional decisions. And that's what we were hoping to do as well, was having a risk and needs assessment for pre-adjudicated youth, which ones could be diverted, but also if somebody was coming through the formal process, what would be an appropriate length of supervision. And then the follow-up to that was using the same kind of tool to guide release decisions from our secure facilities. The third thing that we were trying to do that really kind of goes back to even number one is prioritizing these limited service resources as well. We do have funding that comes from our legislature, kind of general fund dollars that we use throughout New Mexico with what we would call local continuum sites. These are sites that are made up of teams of stakeholders from these communities that apply for funds on a yearly basis. We grant those funds, and then they really help to focus those funds on youth in their community based on their own identified needs. I think what we were seeing, though, is that many of those resources I mentioned before were really going to those lower level youth and then trying to find the balance of not doing away with prevention and intervention, but trying to find a better balance of using dollars on the prevention and intervention piece, but also building up those community resources and supports for the higher risk youth. So those were the three main things that we looked at during that, the putting together of that bill. To talk a little bit about the bill itself, and I will mention this when I get into the next slide, but putting the bill together was a huge undertaking, not only because the short amount of time that we had to kind of put this together, but what we were discovering as we started looking at especially the diversion of dollars to the higher risk youth, we had a lot of pushback from partners that was a little bit surprising. Part of the surprise, I think, was that people weren't completely maybe on board with some of the reforms we were trying to do, but I think the lesson that we learned from that is we didn't do a really good job of educating folks on what we were hoping to accomplish with the diversion of the money. We weren't necessarily taking away their money. We weren't telling them what to do with their money. We really wanted them to find a balance to really serve more youth in their own communities. We presented the bill. We had some support on the bill, but we were really, I think, hurt by not only a lack of time to properly educate people about the bill, but we were also introducing the bill into what we call here in New Mexico a 30-day budget session. in New Mexico, I know Ross talked about that they have a session kind of every other year. We actually have a legislative session every year, but on opposite years, there's a 30-day session that is just for budget reasons, and then the opposite year from that would be a 60-day session, which is more general policy bills that can be presented. So that was part of our struggle as well in just trying to get our juvenile justice reform bill moving forward. But those were the three main things that we looked at in the development of our bill. If we can move on to the next slide with the lessons learned. We did see that the positive collaboration really has huge benefits. When we put together our juvenile justice reform task force, we were sure that we tapped into, educators and legislators and, of course, judges, prosecutors, public defenders, and tried to get a wide range of people. I think we ended up with 22 or 23 people on our task force. And there was a good level of commitment from people, and we really wanted to select those people that were like-minded in reform, but also not being afraid to include people on the task force that were going to push back and to challenge us on some of the things that we were doing. The next success was there was a lot more consensus than disagreement, and I think that's key when you move forward in this kind of work is, you always have to have on the forefront of your meetings and anything that you're doing is what is the goal that you're all looking for. We might have differences in our approach of how to get there, but I don't think anybody is against improving outcomes for youth and families in our community. So really keeping the focus on what that outcome is really help build consensus. We were able to come up with numerous policy changes. We identified things that could be changed. There were some good recommendations that people came together on, which is where we were successful in at least the development of the bill. There was commitment from state leadership to pursue these kinds of changes. That is, as I mentioned before, one of the benefits of having a unified probation system, and it's much easier to roll out reform efforts when you can affect every county together. And then, of course, there were some things that we'd identified that could be implemented without legislation. So even though within our first shot at the bill was the risk assessment tool, that was actually not something that was required to be legislatively, enacted in order for us to move forward, and we continue to move forward on selecting a tool that we'll be able to use in New Mexico. We certainly want to still include the use of the risk assessment tool in dispositional decisions, and that will be included in the reform bill that we will be presented again this upcoming session. The challenges that we learned, though, of course, is you need to have consistent participation. It's hard, so I would caution people when you're putting together any kind of task forces to do reform efforts. Oftentimes, it's not always the decision makers that you need at the table, not because they're not important, but it's a challenge to sometimes get them to commit to attend every meeting and to really be there to make decisions. Another challenge that most jurisdictions always have to encounter is the fear from risk to public safety, that all we're doing is a catch and release, all we are doing is a hug and thug program. But the more you can engage law enforcement as part of your reform efforts and having them at the table, you really can demonstrate how reform does not mean a lack of public safety. Actually, most studies show that you can do these reforms and actually public safety has positive outcomes. And the last thing is hesitation moving forward because of perceived time constraints in short session. That was a challenge just because some of the legislators that were working with us thought we didn't have enough time, but it really gave us a good framework to continue moving forward in reform, and this session will be our third attempt at doing this bill. But having this additional time has really helped us narrow the focus and really focus on the things that will be have the greatest outcomes as we move forward. So thank you once again for the time to present and to be a part of this panel.
Thanks, Nick. We're going to kick things over to Adam from Colorado.
Thanks, Chanel. I just want to, my name is Adam Zarin. I'm a policy advisor for Governor Jared Polis in Colorado. And I just want to first say thank you to the Council of State Governments Justice Center for this opportunity to speak. I also want to make sure to thank Nina Solomon, Chanel Johnson, Courtney Warren, and Nancy Aragona for all of their great work helping our task force in Colorado this last year to push this effort forward. I don't know that we could have done it without them. I would also be remiss not to thank Senators Lee and Gardner, and then Representatives Michelson, Janae, and Soper and Landgraf, who also participated in that task force, and all of our members of the task force to get the work done. It was just a huge, monumental effort, so I just wanted to make sure to do that. So I began this work with Governor John Hickenlooper and continued it with Governor Polis. The assessment that we in CSG did this last year had a number of findings. These 5 bullets that you see in front of you, or 6 bullets that you see in front of you, I just want to highlight the diversion participation, the detention screening effectiveness, length of stay, and it being too long, and failures on probation. Some of the key findings that we had come out of our assessment. What I found especially helpful from the assessment is that it created a one set of facts or one set of talking points that we could speak from, and so that when we engage stakeholders or legislators, that we all knew what was on the table and where what facts we were pointing to. I think it was also helpful for CSG to have completed the assessment because we had an objective third-party observer, and we could then use CSG as somewhat of a buffer when we would come under attack or have to make some type of assertion. I was able to say, this is not the governor's agenda. We have a expert in this field backing up the assertions that we are making. Though, of course, there were challenges that we faced several times. The data that you see in front of you from the assessment, they were disputed. That they disputed the conclusions, and that does happen always. But again, I think having done a third-party comprehensive review of data and findings was powerful in combating that narrative. And I think after the first 2 meetings of our task force, that did not continue. I think one other challenge around the assessment findings, of course, was just how it's framed in conversations and also framed in presentations with the notion of how this might look in the media, making sure that it was factual. And I'm sure that I drove Nina and Chanel crazy, and they hated me for all my meddling sometimes in those conversations. So this last session, we just finished our legislative session, thankfully early May. The governor signed into law Senate Bill 19108 concerning juvenile justice reform. It did all of these bullets plus more, which were all recommendations from our task force that we led last year. And in addition to that, we included dollars that were attached to this bill, about $500,000, and then in our state budget, about $3 million to expand statewide diversion through our Department of Public Safety. I think it's important just, around when trying to pass any type of legislation, there are always challenges. First being, of course, just the legislative process, the sausage making that occurs. But having strong leadership, we had Senator Lee and Gardner were the chairs were past and present chair of Senate Judiciary, and strong members as well in the House who could shepherd a bill through, helps combat any landmines that we may have come across. There are always competing interests, and having a change in administration was also challenging. If I hadn't stayed on from Hickenlooper's administration, I worry about the success of this bill. So I would certainly not recommend to anybody who has a governor who's about to change to try to undertake this, but it worked this time. And then I think the one last concern is, especially with this, when we're having conversations around this bill, is I'm sure a number of states have existing crime or juvenile justice commissions. And so how this work integrates into ongoing work is also really something that needs to be navigated. This slide seems to infer that somehow we've completed all the work, which is not true. The implementation is only just about to begin or is underway. And I think that takes us where we, this is what we saw just on this previous slide, which is where we are today, right? So we are setting up a juvenile justice reform committee that was asked for in the bill, and as well as implementing the dollars for diversion and risk assessment tools that we set aside in both the bill and the budget. And surprisingly enough, especially with a new administration, a new governor, this is the findings, the report, the recommendations are still influencing policymaking at our department. Just this last week, I was having a conversation with our new executive director of the Department of Human Services, which is where the Division of Youth Services is housed, and was able to cite this data and the recommendations and helping guide some of our internal policymaking. In general, I think it's very important to have a very engaged governor and governor's office. And I think I would hope my colleagues around the nation would be interested in doing this work. It's common sense, it's straightforward, and we want to make sure that we stop the school-to-prison pipeline and end cycles of poverty. I also think it's really important because of the governor being able to influence a budget and having sometimes control over a state planning and budgeting office so that you can ensure that the dollars are committed towards doing this work. It's funny how money has a way of bringing people to a table and making sure that they stay focused on the task at hand. If I could, of course, do this all over, I wish I would have known that in Colorado, for example, that the state legislature would be all controlled by the same party as the governor that I work for, but that's neither here nor there. I certainly would have engaged better our own budget office in a much more, and I think maybe other task forces that get set up in states should include someone from a budget office, not just because of just the awareness of what fiscal impact a bill may or may not have, but also there are opportunities where you could, instead of running an all standalone bill, include these as decision items or parts of a budget that is frankly much easier to pass than a standalone bill. And then I think I would have also liked to engage states' legislative or budget committee staff or committees as well. That probably would have helped through this process. And of course, I mean, right now, which is what I'm focused on, which is the hardest part, is implementation. And I'm sure many of you on this webinar call know that. And so that requires an increased amount of stakeholder engagement and stewardship by the departments and my office to make sure that we follow through on what is asked for in the bill. And I think also continued engagement from a governor's office is important here as well, because if you, as our committee, for example, identifies future policy challenges, there are probably resource challenges that we need to identify and remedy that we can then do through a budgeting process. So I think that's all I wanted to say. I appreciate everyone, again, for the time, CSG, for this opportunity to speak.
Great. Thanks, Adam. So we do have a few minutes left to answer some of the questions that you guys have sent in. So I'll just start with the first one. Ross, this is a question for you. Which risk assessment tool did you end up selecting in Nevada?
Chris?
Okay, let's try another question. For Nick, are you still on the line?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. So the question is, if not using a measurement tool, how does New Mexico define and measure success? How does New Mexico balance the needs of public safety and positive youth development?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. So we do track these things. I think our struggle was coming up with really a good measurement of recidivism. So we do track outcomes in different ways. Part of the quarterly reports we give to the legislature is the amount of folks on community supervision that successfully complete, folks that are discharged successfully from our facilities and don't get a new commitment or even a new referral. So we do have different ways. I think we just needed to have a better way to define some of them. So that was part of the struggle. I think we're in a good place with that now. But I also think that piece of the diversion tool, a really good risk assessment diversion tool, will be a major piece of that so that we are putting our resources in the right places. So we do measure, we just weren't probably measuring them in the best way possible.
Great, thanks, Nick. Ross, are you still on the line?
I am. This is Ross.
Okay, so I want to go back to that question. Someone was asking, which tool did you select?
We selected the youth level of service, the YLS.
Mm-hmm. And also, they wanted to know if there's a copy of the legislation for your juvenile justice reform bill available. They said that their state is trying to write proposed legislation to increase reimbursement rates for evidence-based practices.
Yes, all legislation is posted on the Nevada legislature's website, but that individual can also email me. My email is ross.armstrong@dcfs.nv.gov, and I can send a direct link.
One more question for you, Ross. Someone asked, were there any other tools besides the YLS that you considered as a part of this initiative to measure youth development?
Yeah, so we took a look at, I think there's, a couple of the main ones out there, the YLS and the OEAS, and there were a couple of others. And so the way they did that is the Juvenile Justice Oversight Commission assigned a subcommittee, really the risk assessment subcommittee, and they dug deep, and I think we evaluated 5 or 6 different tools and landed on the YLS.
So we did get a few other questions, but we're running pretty close to the end of the webinar. So we can answer, so if you do have additional questions or your question wasn't answered, you can email me here at this email address up on the screen, and I'll be sure to either connect you with Ross, Adam, or Nick, or do my best to answer the question. And just before we jump off, I do have one question for for Adam. Is Colorado also utilizing the YLS?
That's a great question. I do not believe that we are right now, but I'll follow up and connect with Chanel and make sure we get the right answer to that question. But my understanding is that we are not. We are looking at our Department of Youth Services looking at the YAZI, but they have not made a final decision yet.
Great. So once again, I do want to thank you all for taking the time to participate in this webinar. I hope it was helpful. I want to thank Adam, Nick, and Ross for participating. As I mentioned, we will do our best to get you guys answers to the remaining questions and any additional questions that you may have following the end of this webinar. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.